Good morning and welcome to another 50 Acres Academy webinar. Today's topic is what should you do in a PR crisis? It's always a good one to come back to. I think so often we think that if we've got a communication strategy and we've given some thought to social media and we've given thought to various elements of our communications planning, that it's all good. But I think we then come a cropper if we're hit with a communications crisis of whatever sort. So today's webinar is really thinking about the practical things that you need to have established and have given some clear thought to and your team in order to have the preparations done before you get there. So as normal, I'm sure some of you are regular attendees, I know, but just for those who haven't, there is an area in the control panel where you can pop up questions. I'll take questions as we progress, and the webinar is being recorded and so will be up on our YouTube channel, 50 Acres TV, later on today, and we'll also send out a link to that. We'll also send out the slide pack so you've got it as well. So if you have to drop out for any reason, or if there's someone else that you knew wanted to listen and couldn't, then please let them know. So welcome, and I hope everyone's having a good day. We'll get stuck into this, and if there are any questions, as I said, please don't hesitate just to drop them into the box and I'll respond as we progress. So classic question, what should you do in a PR crisis? And my answer was, don't panic, which is obviously something that we all should aim to do. But nonetheless, I think sometimes we do run around in a panic. I remember distinctly some years ago when I worked in another consultancy, a large corporate consultancy that does PR and corporate issues management for large corporates. I was working with a corporate client who had a very serious situation develop in a Pacific island. They had a large asset there, and it was sort of 50% of that particular island's economy. And the economy was taken over by a particular rebel force in the area, and the staff at this particular asset were held hostage, and it was very serious. And the board really didn't know what to do, and I obviously hadn't gone through that myself. It was a very interesting and very different situation. And so, people were really running around in ever-diminishing circles and getting themselves into a lather, and really no one had planned for this. They couldn't plan for something like that. But nonetheless, we got through it. And I think that the rule of thumb is to have some structures in place, and we'll go through what those can be in a moment. But I think one of the things is to say to yourself, don't panic. But I think the way you prevent the panicking is by having some of these very simple processes and having given some thought to how you manage a crisis before it happens. I've written dozens of crisis management strategies. There's many corporates who wanted, and others, not-for-profits, organisations, government departments, who want to try and work out all the different permutations of what a crisis might look like. And of course, you can't do that. You can't predict the unpredictable. That's what a crisis is, partly. So, I think it's something that, we can't ever plan for it, because a crisis never really repeats itself. It's always slightly different, really. The situations, the individual stories, the backstories, the narrative, it's always different. Who's interested, how it's impacting, it's always different. So we can't predict those, but what we can do is plan for them a little bit better. So what we're going to cover today is what is a crisis, how you can prepare for one, the elements of a crisis management plan, what you can learn from a crisis when you look back on it, and we'll lastly get to a crisis planning checklist, which I think is always handy, but hopefully these slides might help you to be able to get some of these structures in place. So, what really is a crisis? Some people say, oh, it's a crisis. It's a word that's bandied around a lot. And, in communications, people often, a lot of clients say to us, we want a crisis management plan. We want to be equipped. We want to be prepared. And of course, you can prepare that. But really, what is a crisis to one organisation may not be a crisis to another. Might be standard operating procedure in some senses. Some organisations are very risk averse. They absolutely shy away from doing anything, saying anything, which can be construed, taken the wrong way. For them, having one of their executives saying something that is a bit out of the ordinary could be a crisis for them. It could be a crisis for their if it's a corporate, could be a crisis for their shareholders, could be a crisis for the bottom line. So a crisis is very different. It's very individual. It's very specific. But look, broadly, here's one definition which we can throw into the mix. Organisational crisis, and bearing in mind that I think most of you here today are from not-for-profits, probably. Organisational crisis is a low probability, but it's a high impact event that threatens the viability of the organisation and is characterised by ambiguity of cause, effects, and means of resolution, as well as by a belief that decisions must be made quickly. It makes sense, really, if you think about it. There's dozens of different ways in which you can define one, but that's a reasonably good starting point. So a crisis can impact on, so many different things, but just to start with, crisis can impact on individuals, public safety, safety of staff, safety of stakeholders. It can result in or potentially impact on financial loss. And it certainly can impact on reputational loss, reputational standing in the community. And that is often one of the biggest threats with a crisis. It's not necessarily, if you peel back the layers and look at the incident, often it's quite predictable that something like that might have happened. It's quite predictable that, X or Y situation happened. If you really look at it, no one was really harmed. No one was injured, no one was killed, etc., etc. But nonetheless, there's some negative stories out there about your organisation or not-for-profit or corporate. That's where the long-term damage can really impact. And I think it's about having a plan in place to make sure you minimise and manage that reputational loss. That's the most important thing. So let's look at what the key elements or the key objectives are in terms of a crisis. So the key elements, I think, in terms of being ready for a crisis is, readiness. How ready are you to deal with something? When I often talk to some of our not-for-profit clients, sometimes they're very large, sometimes they're medium-sized, sometimes they're smaller. Most of them don't have a crisis plan in place, or a lot of them don't. They may have had a board meeting or executive get together to talk about it. They may have some notes. There may be a beginning of a document. And it doesn't have to be complicated. We'll get to that in a moment. But even having just 3 pages of some sort of thing that you can rely on in a practical sense, I think is absolutely imperative. So that's readiness. Response, that's where the plan comes into play. What does that plan tell you? It should really be dictating to some extent, certainly giving you a framework in which you can deal with and respond. It should set out the parameters and guide you in your response. The other very important issue about a crisis is recovery. How do you recover? What do you say publicly? How do you manage the stakeholders that might be concerned, whether they be internal stakeholders, external, government, media, coverage, all of those things? How do you recover? How do you manage that post-crisis situation? Because the crisis really doesn't last for very long. It's, in and of itself, I mean, crisis can be, 24 hours, it can be a week. Really, it's a very indistinct definition, but it's how you recover from that, I think, that's very important. So the key objectives of any crisis communications plan, which I really want to focus on with you today, is to protect the integrity and reputation of the organisation. The goal of the plan is, that we need to have carefully planned communication channels. We have to have timely and open dissemination of information. We need to have open and honest communication with our stakeholders. And we need to acknowledge the responsibility where we need to. Obviously, the most important thing with my lawyer's hat on, I've got a law degree, I've never practiced, so I'm not giving you legal advice here, very big caveat, but is to get legal advice if you're in the midst of something that may have an impact on your bottom line or your reputation, because language is very important in terms of its implication for you being sued or being, facing a legal claim from a variety of stakeholders. So I think it is important, if it's serious, get some legal advice about what you may or may not say and what the implications of what you're saying. Lawyers will always try and simplify, reduce or take out risk to minimise it almost entirely. It's not possible to do that, but that's what their reason d'etre is. And so I think it's always, I'm sure many of you on the phone today have had an argy-bargy argument with a lawyer who've tried to dumb down, simplify, take anything human out of a statement, and you're trying to inject some humanity, some concern, some empathy into something. That's a risk of getting a lawyer involved, but it is sometimes in a crisis really very imperative that you do have a legal advice at the point, and perhaps right through the crisis is usually advisable. So, key elements. What does a crisis management plan involve? Well, there's a crisis management team. We'll talk about how we create that and set that up in a moment. Spokespeople, notification and monitoring systems. So how does your team get told? If you've got an organisation of 4,000, who is told what at what time? They may be seeing some coverage on an evening news bulletin. They may hear about it on the radio. They may read about it in a paper or online. What have they been told, and how do you help manage their response on the ground, out in the field or in your facilities or wherever that might be? What monitoring systems do you have in place to ensure that you are getting the full gamut of media coverage that is being that's out there? So, if you aren't seeing that, you don't know how significant it is. If you're an organisation that can afford media monitoring and you're in the middle of a serious crisis, I would absolutely recommend you getting a very significant amount of monitoring in place during that time, because it really will help you to curate and decide what you do and where you go, and what the level of hysteria, for want of a better word, is, but how social media is responding, how is online media responding, how's radio, TV, what are the stories, what's the tone of them, how can we impact on those stories? Monitoring is absolutely key. If you don't have it, you don't know. You don't know whether there's 5 or 26 stories. And so, you really need to get hold of that monitoring. Stakeholder identification, we need to make sure that we've got the stakeholders in mind that we may or may not need to talk to. It's You know, do we have, 23 sets of stakeholders? Are we talking about, is it confined to one state? Is it confined to 2 or 3 discrete stakeholder groups? If it gets a lot of coverage, what are we talking about here? Who are they? We need to map them out. We need to list them. We need to know how to reach them as well. Messaging. So what's the messaging that we might need to consider for a crisis? Again, a plan is good. A basic structural plan is good. If you're anticipating a crisis, getting some of those messages refined and in place in anticipation of something. You might not know something's coming out in a week or two. Focus in on doing some crisis messaging or pre-preparing that. And positioning, how will you position yourself afterwards or throughout it and after the fact. We're talking here about the recovery. We're talking about how will you be presenting yourself, what tone will you use, etc., etc. So the crisis management team, we've talked about that. It's very important that we have that in place. So in the event of a crisis, the crisis management team will make the decision to activate the crisis plan and agree on key messaging. The crisis management team should include PR counsel or PR support internally, or someone who's going to be responsible for that with your organisation, whoever that might be. Legal counsel and a member of the executive leadership team, or maybe perhaps even more than one, if that's needed. Crisis management team emergency contact list. Now, some organisations might decide that they're going to have the entire executive team on their crisis management team. They might have one that's sort of a movable team. You have sort of 2 or 3 core people. There's PR, legal counsel, and 1 or 2 executive members, with other executive members coming in and out, or other board members perhaps participating as needed is often the way as well. But one of the things that I think we absolutely need to have in place in the event of an emergency is contact details. You can all recall just in the last week, what politician in Australia didn't have Donald Trump's contact details on the night that he won? Now, it's not exactly, well, to some people it was a crisis. A lot of Americans think it's a crisis, but it was badly planned. He didn't have the details, and it was embarrassing that he then had to reach out to Greg Norman to get the details. That wasn't exactly a crisis, but it was ill-planned, not organised. And so, thinking about the sort of numbers that you may need, where are people? Sometimes people are between 2 houses. They're in X or Y. They've got a mobile. They might have 2 mobiles. They might have a number of email addresses. How do you reach people in the event of a crisis? Do you know their broad movements? If they're absolutely critical, how do you get hold of the CEO? How do you get hold of legal counsel? If you can't reach legal counsel, what's the backup? What's the backup plan for each and every one of those people? There must be a backup. So you can't just say, we don't have the legal counsel available. We don't have PR support available, because you need them. You absolutely need them. They're absolutely critical, and you have to have them there as part of that team. And so if those people can't participate in that discussion early on and that work, then you need to find alternatives that will step in. And so this list should be able to be used for that. So, really having substitutions for those key people. Update the list regularly and circulate the list regularly, especially ahead of a public holiday, office holidays, off-site staff days, all of those things, because, a crisis doesn't distinguish from holiday periods to weekends. They just happen. And that's what we need to be prepared for. So I think intelligence gathering is obviously a very important part of managing a crisis. Knowing what's being said, and this is when I talked about media monitoring. And it's not necessarily just exclusively media monitoring. It might be some, often a crisis happens and people speak about it in Parliament. People speak about it in boardrooms. People speak about it in all sorts of different places. And so it's not necessarily the case that it's just in the media that this stuff will be covered. So I think you need to obviously make sure that you're across those different platforms and places. It might be in Hansard that you have to go and look. It may not be that some of those everything's been covered in the media. So where would you find out what is being said about your problem? It might be at a council meeting. Could be anywhere, and you need to be prepared for that. It might be on internal communications channels that you may have some stuff being talked about. It might be on social media. There are social media monitoring tools. There are certainly social media monitoring agencies who will set up monitoring and get that in place in these situations. If you're a large organisation with a risk profile of service providing that perhaps creates a profile that is problematic, then I think it's important to have some of these options that you can fall back on if you need to. So who will monitor your social media? Who will monitor the traditional media? What service provider will you turn to? Will they be able to pick up radio, social media, traditional media at the flick of a switch? That's really what you need. You need it quickly. You don't need to be told by the organisation, oh, we can set it up, but it won't be till Friday. That's just the last thing you need to hear because it's all gone by then. It's all gone. And those first few hours and days is when you can have the greatest impact and greatest control on the situation, and you will lose that if you don't have that monitoring in place. So, that is a golden rule in my view. Notification systems. Now, I think, obviously we talked about intelligence gathering, but it's, Google Alerts can be used if it's something that's low level. It may be that you're talking that it might be customer service responses. It might be that there are blogs, Facebook, all sorts of stuff that people are getting onto and talking about you. So you need to be aware of where those are. Likewise, I would say that you can get very fixated on this stuff. You can really be, so fixated that you're just sitting there reading it, poring over it. If it's a really big problem and it's really causing your organisation a lot of distraction, you personally, as a CEO, as a senior manager, don't need to read every single Facebook post. Perhaps delegate that to someone else so that you are free to make crucial decisions and to respond. Obviously, if you think you really need to read stuff, do it, but often that just creates more problems. It makes people panic. It sends them into a tailspin and they don't focus. So have a think about how far down the crisis management team read and observe. I think it's about making sure that you've got some structures in place of a group of people. If it is a significant issue and you've got a broad range of coverage across a broad range of fronts, that you've got a process in place that will help you to be able to absorb that information and you don't have to do all of it yourself. Spokespeople. Now, this is obviously very, very, very important. We've seen a lot of times where you've seen a crisis and someone's come out and said something that was insensitive, inappropriate, not the right tone, they weren't wearing the right suit, whatever it was, it was wrong. And not only can this be avoided, but you can certainly implement a situation where you get the staff who are going to be spokespeople to be trained and to try and avoid that. Now, you know for a fact that people put their they put their foot in it very often. There's nothing we can do about that. But what we can do is to be as prepared and as trained as we possibly can. So, I certainly would suggest getting regular training, at a very basic level every couple of years. If it's something that if you've got a high-risk organisation, I would think about doing it, every 6 months, every 12 months. Just doesn't have to be a lengthy session. It doesn't have to be a whole day with cameras and sounds and lights and, video equipment and recording equipment and playing back. It is more about going to the CEO or to the senior spokespeople. Where have we gone wrong in the last 6 months? Where have we come unstuck that we could have improved? Let's just run through that. How could we have answered that question better? How could we have had a better process or better response? Let's rehearse some of those lines. Because we can never, we can't ever rehearse for a crisis, so we can't rehearse for the response to it to a great extent. But what we can do is get some very sensible thought processes in place so that the first thing you do, rather than, just jump out the door to the waiting media and go and speak to them, you obviously make sure that you've got whatever you're going to say very much planned and in mind. And it might be simple, it might be short, it might be cautious, but it's appropriate. The tone is correct. The legal implications are minimised. You've maximised your reputational strengths in the situation. You've minimised your reputational loss. And really you're getting the best out of a bad situation when you first step out into the media in whichever form you do that, whether that's a public statement, whether that's, physically fronting the media, or it might be both. And so you need to be prepared for that. And if it really is significant, then you might, want to bring in a media trainer at that point, or someone who will hold your hand, who will really just be that alternative voice, that sort of voice in your ear going, no, actually, I think you need to do that a bit better. That's not good enough. It's not strong enough. It's not compassionate enough, or whatever that is. You need to have someone around you, if you're going to be a spokesperson, who will challenge you and who won't just go, yeah, that's great, because that's what you don't need in a crisis. You need someone who'll go, no, we actually need to get this right. We need to get the tone right, because this is important. We're going to have a lot of coverage here. We're going to have a lot of attention. The only way we're going to do that is if we get it right. We're only going to fix it or come out of this with a held high is if we get it the best we possibly can at the beginning. So with the spokespeople, select at least 2, I think, to undertake the training. And as I said, regularly is great, as regularly as you possibly can. It's critical, I think, to establish communication systems that will allow your organisation to rapidly reach stakeholders using a variety of communications methods. So how do you do that? All methods of contact, I think, with the communications, with the CMT, the crisis management team, should be included on the CMT contact list. Aim for more than one. And obviously, if you're needing to talk to all staff instantly, how do you do that? You send them an email, send them a text. How is it going to happen? Is it something you need to post on social media immediately? What are the channels that you're going to be using for external communication and internal communication? So in terms of stakeholders, we need to make sure that we're thinking about internal and external stakeholders, because they both matter very much in an effective crisis communications plan. Your internal stakeholders, mainly employees and staff, they're very critical because they're carrying your message. They're queuing up for milk at the supermarket. They're hearing people speak about it at the local baker or butcher or wherever, they're bumping into people. People know that they work there. They're going to be asked their view and their response to what's happening. And so they need to have some information themselves to be best equipped as they can. Now, if you've got 4,000 staff, you're never going to get them all saying the same thing. You're never going to be perfect. Some of them might be critical. Some of them might not say exactly what you want. But you've really got to give them the best chance that they can to have a go at delivering positive PR as representatives for your organisation. So stakeholders could include staff, board, customers, clients, government, donors, key suppliers, unions, other people who are part of the supply chain of your particular organisation, and that could be many and varied. In terms of holding statements, I think, typically people will, talk about having holding statement. While full message development must await the outbreak of an actual crisis, I think you can have some holding statements and messages designed for use immediately after a crisis breaks. You can at least have a go at a few of them rather than sort of leaving it up to when people are sort of panicking. I think that's sort of helpful. Oh, sorry. Sorry, I just flicked off the screen. After crisis breaks. They can be developed in advance to be used for a wide variety of scenarios. And again, you don't do your head in thinking about 62 different ways in which you can potentially need to talk about a crisis. Get some basic holding lines down on a piece of paper, and then you can modify them as you progress. What do holding statements include? Well, they typically include, the who, what, when and where of whatever's happening. Really because you don't really want to pre-guess, you don't want to preempt what you might find out about it once you've actually looked into it. You don't want to start by taking responsibility entirely for something that may not end up needing to be taken. So you've got to be careful, but you've got to be equally, you've got to say something, because as we all know, with holding statements in these sorts of situations, if you don't say something, it'll just be made up, and you don't need, you really don't need that in these situations. That's absolutely for sure. What you do need is to, take control, and as far as you really can. Holding statements might typically include this sort of statement, organisation blah, blah, blah is aware of the blah, blah, blah situation at wherever today. We've implemented a crisis response plan which places the highest priority on the health, safety and wellbeing of our staff, and our customers will be supplying additional information as it comes to hand or as it's available, which will be available on our website and social media channels. I mean, some sort of combination of that is really what we're talking about here. Something very simple, something that really just gives some sense that that you are really doing something. You're cognizant that there is a problem and that you are getting on top of it and managing it. Depending on the nature of the crisis, other points might include, we're currently cooperating with police and the relevant authorities, or our staff and clients' welfare is, paramount and our primary concern. Those sorts of things, obviously making sure that, you're expressing some degree of concern. But again, as I said before, you may not want to take responsibility right at the very outset because I think it's not really legally prudent to do so until you really know that that's what you want to do. Organisational positioning. Once a crisis has been identified, the CMT needs to agree to adopt, a number of positions. You need to talk about it. You've put a holding statement out there. What's the next step? So, you might be talking about it was human error, it was clerical error, there was some unauthorised procedures, inadequate supervision, inadequate quality control, misuse of confidential information, errors of judgment, inadequate standard operating procedures, or an uncontrolled event or natural disaster. So, it could be any manner of things, and that's just a very tiny, tiny list. It could be hundreds of other things as well. In terms of activation, I think we talked about this a second ago, but as soon as the situation that could escalate to a crisis unfolds, the CMT should communicate immediately to each other to determine whether the crisis plan should be activated, and if so, what position the organisation might take. If and as soon as the crisis unfolds, communicate with stakeholders immediately, even if you don't say very much at that point. If you don't, your organisation could lose its opportunity to control the events. And what it does is it signals that you have lines of communication open. People can contact you, and you can at least say something to them, whatever it is that you're able to say at that point. So once the crisis plan has been activated and the holding statement issued, work can then be undertaken to gather more details and prepare a range of communications materials, which we've just gone through and detailed here. Sorts of things that you might think about having or using, obviously, media releases, media statements, is further explanation of the issues and the facts at hand based on organisational position and the position that you're being advised to take, you decided as a group to take. Key messages that's used in the media release, used based on the facts available and, the position that you're taking as an organisation. And the spokesperson briefing notes. That person may get a range of questions or be in a situation where they have to answer a number of different angles. Obviously, they can't necessarily look at those notes, but if at least, or they can't, if they're doing a TV interview, for example, they can't use those notes, but they can have them on hand and refresh their memory through the interviewing and media managing process, which I think is always very important. In terms of media, I think all statements to the media should be approved by the executive and legal teams. If it is really truly a crisis and it has reputational or financial implications, then I think you are duty bound to your board and to your stakeholders, to your clients, customers, whoever they are, perhaps even shareholders if you're a corporate and if you're a social enterprise. You're really duty bound and probably legally bound, and it would be absolutely prudent to get legal advice, as we spoke about before. So tips I think here are that all spokespersons should stick to the key messages. If you need to, defer to the police, when it's appropriate. And ensure wherever as much as possible that the message is conveyed is not necessarily, optimistic, but positive. It's not all doom and gloom. By positive, I mean, we are, equipping ourselves with information so that we can best manage this for people, for our stakeholders, for the customers, for the community, for the whatever. Now, that's not an optimistic, full of sort of joy statement, but it's a positive statement in the sense of you're doing something constructive. So it's not a negative statement as in, we have no idea how this happened. We really are lost for words. We'll come back to you when we know more. I mean, that's really a cop-out. So, think about the recent incident on the Gold Coast, obviously completely unprecedented. They wouldn't have envisaged that might have happened, although, what they do is a risky activity up at Dreamworld, but they certainly wouldn't have envisaged that could have happened. A number of people have commented about how they handled the situation afterwards. But, nonetheless, when they did come out and they had something to say, it generally was constructive. It was indicating that they were doing something. I think one of the things that obviously is very clear in these situations is as people talk. I mean, the families talked about the fact that no one had been in contact with them in the first 48 hours. That became a story. So I think you need to very quickly think through the sorts of steps you might need to make in order to deal with it in a public sense. What are people expecting from you? What are the community expecting from you? What do you need to do to manage this, and what might be some of the complications that come out of a particular incident or situation. So, media monitoring, we talked about this before and how important it is. You need to review media outlets that have inquired about the situation. You need to see what they're covering. Lots of outlets nowadays have, absolutely huge churn in terms of coverage. They add to stories, they evolve, they start at the beginning of the day. By the end of the day, there's 6 stories about something. So you need to keep an eye on who are contributing to those stories. They might have different reporters out in the field, different angles coming in, different stories about a particular incident coming in. You just don't know. So, you need to monitor all of those sites that may have been covering it. Review all the media, conduct regular searches through Google for keywords, and obviously monitor all social media sites. If you can afford it, if you can get it in place, have paid professional monitoring if it's a very, very big crisis or something that really has a very great deal of impact, and you can, as an organisation, manage the cost of professional monitoring. It's certainly worth considering. Learning from a crisis, and obviously, when it's happening, none of us think we're going to get out of it, and nothing's going to get better. But I think one of the things that we can do is learn from a crisis. We can always learn from things that happen to us professionally. And I think once the crisis has been managed, it's valuable to hold a meeting with the CMT and other relevant people, inside your organisation to assess the management of the crisis, what worked well, what didn't work, and activities that could be improved going forward. It's really useful, I think, to document the learnings and adapt the crisis communication strategy accordingly. And perhaps, there is a depository of information on a server in your organisation that is obviously kept discreetly out of hands reach for the majority of staff. It probably is only accessible to a very small group, but, some of those learnings could be, documented in that way so that they can obviously be there for people in the future rather than just sitting in someone's notebook that isn't used again. So we're just getting to the end here. So if anyone's got any questions, we're about to finish up. This is the last, second last slide. So in terms of a crisis planning checklist, these are the things, just to recap what we've gone through today. Establish and brief the crisis management team. Establish a crisis management team emergency contact list. Circulate their contact details to all staff. Make it available online and in hard copy, because you might have a staff member who occasions themselves across a crisis. They can't reach their immediate supervisor. Who do they turn to? What do? They know something's wrong, or they hear something, or they want to be a whistleblower. It could manifest in all sorts of different ways. You need to be able to give the opportunities for all staff to be able to report incidences or deal with the crisis there and then. Identify key spokespeople and backup spokespersons. Undertake crisis management and media training with the CMT as regularly as you can afford. Establish crisis notification and monitoring systems. I think that's very important. Have a think about how that will work and what you will be able to resource if and when you're in a crisis. Identify stakeholders and an ability to contact and reach out to those stakeholders, as indicated by the Prime Minister's inability to be able to reach President-elect Donald Trump when he needed to. How do we reach out to those stakeholders if we need to in a time of crisis? Create a range of holding statements so that they are ready, and brainstorm positioning and the different impacts that a position might take and what the expectations are on your organisation. What are the different nuances that you need to be across and be aware of? So I hope that's been helpful today. Again, as I mentioned earlier, we'll have this recording up on our YouTube channel, 50 Acres TV, later today, and we'll send you out the link to that and also the slides. Now, I've just had a question come in. Advice for dealing with negative community on social media. Look, I think if you've got control of a site and you can, I'm not saying go in and delete holus bolus, that would be seen as well. I mean, if you just went in and just deleted an entire thread somewhere, it's pretty apparent that that's the case. If someone's being abusive, if they're being racist or sexist or inappropriate, then clearly you have absolutely good reason to delete their comments and perhaps block them as a user. The problem that you do, though, have when you do that is, what do you do when you have an angry person and you stop them from coming in one door? They'll try and find another way of getting in there. So they'll go to another platform and, or they'll do something. So, if you can manage them, obviously that's better. But some people can't be managed. And as we know from social media, people go to social media when they're angry. And so sometimes it's appropriate to respond, again, professionally, with some form of, emotion, rather than just sort of appearing to be sort of stale and corporate and formal. But I think, at times it's appropriate to delete them, but bear in mind that there could be impacts with doing that. At other times there will be good reason to respond. Sometimes you're dealing with people who are very well known to you. They are, they've done it before. They're your little sort of annoying person in the corner, or one of many. So it really depends on the situation you are dealing with and how serious it is. But I think deleting a comment on social media, check with your lawyers. I've not actually ever asked this question, whether there's any legal ramifications from it. I expect that if you are the administrator of a site, you can probably delete anything you want if it's on your site. But again, if you've got a whole lot of stuff and you want to delete it and you're in the middle of a situation and you've got a lawyer on board, it might be just best running that up the flagpole with them as well. I hope that's helpful. So if there's no other questions, we will probably just wrap up now. Let me know if there is, because we're just about to wrap up. So the thing that I wanted to tell you about is our next webinar, talking about Donald Trump. I thought we might spend some time thinking about the implications for engagement and communications. Everyone's talking about disruption. Everyone's talking about, we didn't know it was going to happen. The polls weren't telling us. It's about the rejection of elites. What does all of that mean? And I think there's some really interesting lessons to be drawn in terms of where we might go with communications. I suppose one of the things that I'm thinking is that we really simplify what we're saying, because I think one of the things that came out of the US election, and also Brexit, and to some extent the Australian election, is that complex messages aren't cutting it with a huge group of people anymore. They're seeing them for what they are, and they're looking through them and looking to other people to represent them in a more gutsy way. And so that's what we'll be reflecting on in the next webinar. So I hope you can join us. The link is on our website, but we'll also send you a link in the email we send you later today. Thank you again, and I hope you all have a great day, and I hope that was helpful, and I hope you don't have any crises between now and Christmas, or indeed over the new year, and then you all have a great holiday with it crisis-free. But if you do have any crises, hopefully this information will have been some assistance. Have a lovely day, and good to have spoken with you all.